I always believed that family was a bond that could never be broken. I thought that no matter how hard life became, no matter the weight of struggles, at the end of the day your children would always see you as their safe place. But I was wrong. My daughter, the very child I had raised with all the strength I could gather, the little girl I carried through storms and sickness, one day looked at me not as a mother, not as someone who sacrificed everything for her comfort, but as nothing more than an extra mouth to feed. Those words, sharp, cold, and ungrateful, cut deeper than any wound I had ever endured in my life. It didn't happen suddenly. No, it was like a slow unraveling of love, thread by thread, until one day the cloth was gone. For years, I had lived with her after her father passed away. I cooked meals, cleaned the home, and even helped raise her children. I was there every single day, bandaging scraped knees, making late-night soup when someone was sick, and being the shoulder she leaned on when bills piled too high. I never asked for payment, never demanded thanks, because she was my daughter. It was my duty, my love. But love, I learned, can be blind to how others truly see you. I began to notice the whispers. Her husband's sighs when I sat at the dinner table. The way she looked at me when I saved leftovers or reminded her to turn off the lights to save electricity. At first, I brushed it off. I told myself they were stressed, that money was tight, and that they didn't mean it. But small comments started slipping through. "Mom, don't you think it's time you had your own place?" Or, "We can't keep carrying all the weight here, you know." Carrying the weight. I was the one carrying them. The night it all happened is forever seared into my memory. I had cooked dinner, like always, a stew that filled the house with warmth. I set the table, proud to provide even this small comfort. We sat down together, and her husband made some offhand joke about me being the permanent guest. Everyone laughed, except me. My daughter looked at me and, without hesitation, said, "Mom, you know we can't keep doing this. You're just an extra mouth we can't afford anymore." Silence. My heart pounded in my chest, my ears rang. Did my daughter really just say that? Did she really reduce me, the woman who carried her in my womb, who gave up dreams and youth and nights of sleep, to a burden? My fork slipped from my hand and clattered against the plate. Her children looked at me, confused, not understanding the gravity of what their mother had just said. My lips trembled, but no words came out. I excused myself quietly and went into the small room they had given me. That night, I cried like I hadn't cried since her father died. But here is where the story shifts. Because when you hit the bottom, when the very people you thought would hold you up push you down instead, you either break, or you rise. I wasn't ready to break. Not after all I had endured. Not after all I had given. They thought I was powerless, just a tired old woman taking up space. But they forgot something crucial. I had built my life on survival, on sacrifice, and on strength. And if they wanted me gone, if they thought I was nothing more than an extra mouth, then I would show them just how wrong they were. The very next morning, I packed my small bag. I didn't fight, I didn't argue. I simply left. My daughter's eyes widened in surprise, maybe even guilt, as I walked out that door. But guilt wasn't going to pay her mortgage, and respect wasn't going to come back so easily. I walked down that street, my old legs trembling but my mind sharper than ever, and I made a promise to myself, I would not be discarded. I would not be forgotten. And one day, one very soon day, they would realize just how much they had lost when they called me an extra mouth. The first few days after leaving their home were the hardest of my life. I had no plan, no savings tucked away, and no certainty of where I would go. All I carried was a small bag of clothes and the pain of being cast aside by my own daughter. I walked down those streets, feeling smaller with each step, as though the world itself was pushing me into the shadows. I tried not to think about where I would sleep that night, but as the sun set and the air grew colder, fear crept in. For the first time in decades, I felt homeless, not just without a roof, but without belonging. I ended up at a shelter, where strangers became my companions. The beds were hard, the air thick with sadness, and the faces around me worn down by life's cruelties. I lay awake on that first night, listening to the sound of muffled sobs and restless turning. I thought about the warm bed I had made for my grandchildren, the home-cooked meals I had left behind, the walls filled with laughter that no longer wanted me. My heart ached, but slowly, another feeling began to stir beneath the grief: anger. Anger at being discarded like trash. Anger at being reduced to a mouth, when I had been the hands, the heart, the backbone of that household. The next morning, I stared at myself in the cracked mirror of the shelter's bathroom. My face was lined, my hair streaked with gray, but my eyes, oh, my eyes still burned with fire. I whispered to my reflection, "You are not finished. You are not worthless. You are not an extra mouth." Those words became my armor. In the days that followed, I walked the streets searching for work. Anything. People looked at me and saw only my age, but they didn't know my history. I had once managed a small business with my late husband. I had handled numbers, contracts, and people. That experience was buried, forgotten even by me, but not gone. And as fate would have it, I stumbled across an old acquaintance, Mr. Patel, who used to own a shop near my husband's. He almost didn't recognize me, but when he did, his face softened with pity. "Where have you been all these years?" he asked gently. I told him the truth, as much as I could without letting the tears fall. He sighed and said, "You were always a fighter. Don't let them take that away." Then, as if guided by fate, he mentioned that his cousin was looking to sell a property, an old building with several units, worn but full of potential. My ears perked up. A building? The word alone sent a thrill through me. I didn't have the money, but suddenly, my mind was alive with possibilities. That night, lying on the hard shelter bed, I thought about it again and again. A building meant stability. A building meant income. A building meant control. And most of all, it meant power. If my daughter and her husband wanted me gone, if they wanted to treat me as nothing but a burden, then perhaps the universe was giving me a chance not only to stand again but to stand taller than ever before. But how could I possibly afford such a thing? That question haunted me, yet instead of crushing me, it lit a fire. I began visiting banks, sitting in lobbies surrounded by men in suits, my small notebook clutched in hand. Most laughed me out the door. "At your age? A mortgage? Impossible." But I didn't stop. I researched government programs, talked to lawyers, and even found a small group of women entrepreneurs who gave me guidance. Days turned into weeks, and each rejection only sharpened my resolve. Then, a miracle, or maybe just the reward of persistence, happened. A community credit union, one that focused on helping older women and widows, decided to give me a chance. They saw my determination, they saw my plan, and they approved a modest loan. I remember clutching that paper, tears streaming down my face, because in that moment I wasn't a burden anymore, I was a fighter again. When I signed the papers and walked through that creaky old building for the first time, I felt a surge of pride I hadn't felt in years. The walls were cracked, the floors uneven, but to me, it was a castle. My castle. And with every step, I imagined the future. Apartments rented out, money flowing in, independence secured. No one would ever look at me as an extra mouth again. What I didn't realize then, as I touched the peeling paint and looked out those dusty windows, was how closely my fate was about to collide with my daughter's once more. Because the very building I now owned, was the same one where she and her husband lived. The day I discovered that my daughter and her husband were tenants in the very building I now owned was one I'll never forget. At first, it almost felt like a cruel joke, as if fate was toying with me. I walked through the dimly lit hallway of the building, inspecting each door and making notes on repairs that needed to be made. The smell of old wood and dust hung in the air, and the floor creaked with every step. Then I saw it, Unit 3B. A familiar doormat with my grandchildren's tiny handprints painted across it. My heart stopped. I bent down and ran my fingers over the faded paint, memories flooding back of when I had helped them make it as a fun weekend project. My throat tightened. This was their apartment. Their home. I stood frozen for what felt like hours. Should I knock? Should I announce myself? But no. Not yet. I wasn't ready to face them, not as the woman they had kicked out, not as the burden they had abandoned. I wanted to face them as something else entirely. I wanted to face them as the landlord. So I straightened my back, clutched my notebook tighter, and walked away. That night, I couldn't sleep. My mind swirled with emotions. Part of me still ached for the daughter I had raised, for the child I had carried in my arms, whose tears I had wiped away countless times. But another part of me, stronger now, burned with the memory of her words, "You're just an extra mouth." Those words had nearly broken me. Now, they were the steel in my spine. I whispered into the silence of my small rented room, "She will learn. They will both learn." In the following weeks, I began to make changes in the building. Repairs were scheduled, contracts updated, and a new rental policy was drafted. Tenants began receiving polite but firm notices about overdue rents, safety inspections, and adjustments that needed to be made. I handled it all with precision, a sharpness I didn't even realize I still had within me. Years of being overlooked, dismissed, and treated like nothing had sharpened into a weapon: organization and authority. It wasn't long before word spread that the building had a new owner. Some tenants were curious, some wary. And then came the day I had been waiting for. My daughter and her husband came to the management office. I'll never forget the look on her face when she walked in and saw me sitting behind the desk, papers neatly arranged before me. Her mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. Her husband, however, scoffed. You're running this place," he said with mocking disbelief. I didn't flinch. I looked him square in the eyes and replied, "Not running it. Owning it." The silence that followed was sweeter than any victory I could have imagined. My daughter's face turned pale, her eyes darting to the floor, while her husband's arrogant smirk faltered. For the first time in years, I held the power. They tried to brush it off. He laughed, said it was cute that I had managed to get my hands on the property, that it wouldn't last. But I leaned forward, my voice steady and calm, and said, "This building is mine. Which means your roof, your walls, your very shelter, it all depends on me. You called me an extra mouth. Well, let's see how you do without my hands feeding you." The color drained from his face then, though he tried to recover quickly. My daughter stayed silent, and I caught her glancing at me with something I couldn't quite read: fear, regret, maybe even shame. Over the next several months, I continued running the building with firm authority. Rents were collected on time, repairs made efficiently, and slowly, the property began to transform. The tenants who had once ignored me now respected me. Some even admired me for taking control at my age. And all the while, I watched my daughter and her husband struggle. They were always late on rent, always making excuses. I listened patiently, gave them warnings, but kept everything by the book. No favoritism, no mercy. At night, though, when I lay in my bed, I would sometimes feel the old ache of motherhood tugging at me. Should I forgive her? Should I ease her burden? But then I remembered the sting of her voice, the way she had dismissed me, the way she had pushed me out into the cold. No. This wasn't about cruelty. This was about justice. This was about balance. And then came the day when their excuses no longer mattered. The rent had to be raised. Costs of maintenance had gone up, the market had shifted, and as a landlord, I had every right. Notices were sent to all tenants. Some grumbled, some accepted it. But for my daughter and her husband, it was a crushing blow. Their faces when they read that notice. I can still see it. Little did they know, this was only the beginning. When the rent increase took effect, the building buzzed with whispers. Some tenants accepted it grudgingly, muttering under their breath about the rising cost of everything. A few came to the office, trying to negotiate, but they left understanding that this was not a game of favorites. I treated every tenant equally, with the same firm but respectful hand. For once in my life, I commanded respect without begging for it. And then there were my daughter and her husband. The day they received their notice, they stormed into the office. He came first, his footsteps loud in the hall, anger radiating from him like heat. My daughter trailed behind, her eyes downcast, almost like she knew better than to pick this fight. He slammed the paper down on the desk so hard that my pens rattled in their holder. "What is this?" he barked, pointing at the letter. "You can't just raise the rent like this. We can't afford this." I looked at him calmly, folding my hands in front of me. "Yes, I can. It's within the law, and all tenants received the same notice." His face turned red. "Don't play smart with me. You're just," he paused, glancing at my daughter, but I knew exactly what word was about to leave his mouth. "Just an extra mouth. Just a burden. Just a maid." But this time, he stopped himself. I leaned back in my chair, my eyes locked on his. "Finish your sentence. Go ahead." He swallowed hard, the anger in his eyes flickering into something else. My daughter's lips trembled as if she wanted to speak, but she stayed silent. I could feel her shame, heavy in the air between us. "This isn't fair," he muttered finally, lowering his voice. "We've got kids to take care of. You can't expect us to pay this much." And that was when I felt it, the strange mix of satisfaction and sorrow. The same man who once sneered at me, who let me be tossed aside like I was nothing, now stood in front of me begging for mercy. My heart twisted. For a brief second, the mother in me wanted to ease his pain, to protect my daughter from this humiliation. But then the voice of memory came back. That night. Those words. "Extra mouth. You'll find a way," I said quietly but firmly. "Because you always do, don't you? Or maybe you'll have to learn what struggling really feels like." He glared at me, but he knew the truth, there was nothing he could do. My daughter shifted uncomfortably, her hands gripping the strap of her purse, her knuckles white. For a moment, her eyes met mine, and I saw tears forming. But she didn't let them fall. They left in silence, and I sat there for a long while after, staring at the closed door. My heart was heavy, yet steady. I wasn't destroying them. I wasn't cruel for the sake of cruelty. I was simply holding up a mirror to the life they had chosen when they cast me out. In the weeks that followed, I watched them stumble under the new rent. He worked longer hours, she cut corners on groceries. I could see their children looking thinner, their clothes worn a little more. It wasn't easy for me to witness, I'm still a mother, after all. But every time I thought about stepping in, I reminded myself, they had made their choice. They had told me I was nothing, and now they were learning just how wrong they were. The irony of it all wasn't lost on me. They had once told me I was a burden. That I was costing them too much. Yet now, here I was, the one holding the keys to their shelter, the one who could decide whether they stayed or went. The power shift was almost poetic. And yet, beneath the satisfaction, there was still that ache of love. I would catch myself lingering outside their door sometimes, hearing the children's laughter, the sound of bedtime stories being read. I missed them desperately. I missed being part of their lives. But love alone could not erase the disrespect. Love could not erase the betrayal. One late evening, as I locked up the office, my daughter came by alone. Her face was pale, her eyes hollow from exhaustion. She didn't speak at first. She just stood there, twisting her wedding ring nervously. Finally, in a whisper, she said, "Mom. I'm sorry." My heart stopped. Those words, so small, so fragile, hit me harder than any insult ever had. I opened my mouth to respond, but before I could, she shook her head, tears spilling down her cheeks. "He doesn't understand. He doesn't see what you've done. But I do. I know you worked hard for this. I know I hurt you. I was wrong." I wanted to reach out, to hold her, to forgive her instantly. But a part of me hesitated. Apologies are easy when the walls are closing in. True regret, real change, takes time. So I placed a hand on her shoulder and said, "Words are a start. But words aren't enough." She nodded, wiped her tears, and left. And as I watched her walk away into the night, I knew the battle was far from over. The real test had only just begun. The days following my daughter's betrayal felt like a blur, each moment soaked in a strange mixture of grief and determination. I had cried in silence, not because of the cramped room I rented or the meals I sometimes skipped, but because of the cruel truth that my own blood saw me as nothing more than an extra mouth to feed. The sting of those words lingered in my chest like an open wound. But as the hurt festered, something else began to grow alongside it, a quiet, burning resolve that whispered to me every night, "You are not done yet." Each insult replayed in my head became fuel. Every look of dismissal from my daughter's husband, every cold shoulder from the grandchildren I had once held close, hardened my heart into steel. I decided that if they saw me as a burden, I would show them that I was far from powerless. I began to plan in silence. I still had some savings, carefully tucked away, though modest compared to the wealth my daughter and her husband flaunted. I started making discreet inquiries, visiting local offices, and speaking with people I trusted. Days turned into weeks, and my search slowly unraveled an opportunity so perfect that it almost felt like fate itself was guiding me. Their apartment building, the very place where they lived and treated me like an unwanted guest, was up for sale. The owner was an old acquaintance who wanted to move abroad, desperate to sell quickly. He needed someone who could act fast. I saw it as more than a transaction. It was a chance to reclaim my dignity, to rise from the ashes of humiliation they had cast me into. The irony was almost poetic. I remembered how they had smirked when telling me to pack my things, not realizing that destiny had already laid this opportunity before me. My heart pounded as I signed the initial documents. I could hardly sleep at night, the excitement and anxiety battling within me, but beneath it all was a deep satisfaction. They had no idea what was coming. It was not revenge for the sake of revenge, it was a lesson, one I hoped would pierce deeper than any words I could ever say. When the deal was finalized and the building became mine, I sat quietly in the tiny room I had called home and let the reality sink in. The tears that fell this time were not from pain but from triumph. I thought of the countless sacrifices I had made for my daughter, working late shifts, skipping meals so she could eat, mending clothes so she would never feel poor among her friends, and now she would learn that the woman she discarded still carried strength she could never measure. I kept my secret close, telling no one of the purchase. Instead, I observed from the shadows as they carried on with their lives, unaware that the very roof over their heads now belonged to me. Every insult, every dismissal, had led to this moment, and though my hands trembled with anticipation, I remained calm. Timing was everything. And when the right moment arrived, they would face the truth in a way they could never ignore. Weeks passed, and with every sunrise I felt my patience tested, but I knew I had to play the long game. Owning their building gave me power, but power unused is nothing more than a quiet secret. I visited the property manager under the guise of being a new investor, and walked through the halls of the building with a strange sense of déjà vu. I had once walked those same steps with groceries in my arms, exhausted from cooking for my daughter's family, only to be met with cold silence. Now, every door, every stairwell, every crack in the walls answered to me. The weight of that reality filled me with pride, but also with a somber awareness. This wasn't just about control, it was about restoring the balance they had shattered when they tossed me aside. I would often see my daughter and her husband in the building's courtyard, laughing with neighbors or rushing out to their expensive car, completely oblivious to the fact that their landlord was the woman they had called an extra mouth. There was an odd thrill in walking past them unnoticed, my head held high, knowing that one signature of mine could change their entire lifestyle. But I waited. I wanted them to feel secure, to believe their lives were untouched, so that when the moment arrived, the shock would cut deeper. The opportunity came sooner than I had expected. Tenants had been complaining about rising costs in the city: food, fuel, utilities. The pressure was building, and the whispers about rent increases floated around like storm clouds. My property manager advised me, "Ma'am, if we adjust the rent now, people might grumble, but they'll have no choice but to pay. It's the way things are." His words struck a chord. I wasn't blind to the struggles of the other tenants, but for my daughter and her husband, this increase wouldn't just be an inconvenience, it would be poetic justice. They had treated me like I was disposable, like money and comfort gave them superiority. Now, they would learn what it meant to struggle. I signed the notice that raised the rent across the building. My hands shook as I pressed the pen to paper, not from hesitation but from the sheer weight of the moment. For the other tenants, I ensured the increase was fair, something they could still manage without being crushed. But for my daughter's unit, I made it clear through additional terms that their comfort would come at a price. When the notices were delivered, I sat quietly in my room, imagining the scene unfolding in their apartment. My daughter's voice rising in disbelief, her husband pacing with frustration, the realization dawning on them that their finances were tighter than they had thought. The very next evening, I passed by their door as muffled arguments spilled into the hallway. Words like unfair, impossible, and how are we going to manage echoed faintly through the walls. For a moment, my heart ached, because beneath the anger I heard the voice of the little girl who once cried for me when she scraped her knee. But then I remembered the night she looked me in the eye and said I was nothing but a burden. That memory hardened me again. I didn't reveal myself yet. No, this was only the beginning. I wanted them to live with the growing weight of rent pressing down on them, to taste the bitterness of choices made without compassion. And as I turned away from their door, a strange calm settled over me. They had taught me what it felt like to be unwanted. Now, I was teaching them what it meant to take for granted the very person who had given them everything. The tension in their household grew like a storm trapped behind closed doors. Days after the rent hike notice, I noticed their usual confident stride replaced by hurried, whispered conversations in the stairwell. My daughter, who once flaunted her expensive handbags and treated me like an unpaid servant, now carried grocery bags that were noticeably lighter. Their dinners were no longer lavish spreads but small, meager meals I glimpsed through their window as I walked past the courtyard. It was almost surreal to watch, the very family that had told me I was an extra mouth, now struggling to feed themselves. One evening, I overheard them arguing as I passed by again. My daughter's voice was sharp, filled with desperation. "We can't keep up, Mark. Between the car payments, the utilities, and now this ridiculous rent, how are we supposed to survive?" Her husband shot back with equal frustration, blaming her spending habits and lack of savings. Their once polished, perfect image was crumbling, and the irony wasn't lost on me. They had pushed me out to preserve their lifestyle, yet now that lifestyle was suffocating them under its own weight. Part of me wanted to step in, to knock on their door and offer the comfort I had once given so freely. But the other part of me, the part that remembered every cold shoulder, every harsh word, kept me rooted in place. They needed this lesson. They needed to understand that the foundation of a home isn't luxury, but love, respect, and gratitude. Without those things, even the finest walls can collapse. When I returned to my apartment that night, I felt a flicker of guilt, but it quickly faded as I reminded myself of the countless nights I had cried alone after they cast me aside. They hadn't hesitated to humiliate me. Why should I hesitate to let them face the reality of their choices? Justice, I realized, doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers quietly, watching from the shadows as consequences unfold. And so I waited, letting the pressure build, knowing that soon the walls of their pride would crumble completely. The breaking point came sooner than I expected. A week later, I found a folded note slipped under my apartment door. It wasn't signed, but I knew immediately whose handwriting it was, my daughter's. Her elegant cursive, once reserved for thank you cards and birthday wishes, now trembled across the paper. "Mom, can we talk? Please." I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at those words for a long time. Part of me felt a pang of sorrow. I had been waiting for this moment, but I hadn't anticipated how heavy it would feel when it finally came. My daughter, who had once looked me in the eye and called me an extra mouth, was now the one reaching out for help. A small part of me wanted to rip up the note, to let her stew in the mess she had created. But the larger part, the mother in me, couldn't ignore her plea. That evening, I climbed the stairs to their apartment. When she opened the door, the sight before me nearly stopped my breath. The once spotless living room was cluttered, toys scattered across the floor, dishes piled high in the sink. My son-in-law sat on the couch, head buried in his hands, his shirt wrinkled and his eyes weary. My daughter stood there, stripped of the proud confidence she always carried, looking more like the little girl who used to run to me after scraping her knee. "Mom," she whispered, her voice cracking. "We're drowning." I didn't say anything at first. I wanted her to feel the weight of the silence. She gestured for me to sit, and reluctantly, I did. She explained how they had maxed out their credit cards, how her husband's hours had been cut at work, how the mortgage on top of the rent increase had left them with almost nothing. "I thought we could handle it," she admitted, tears streaming down her cheeks. "But we can't. We can't do this anymore." For years, I had been invisible in this very room, treated like furniture, spoken to only when they needed something. But now, every pair of eyes in that room was on me, waiting, desperate. My son-in-law finally looked up, his pride clearly shattered. "We're asking you for mercy," he said quietly. The irony was staggering. I, the discarded mother, that extra mouth, now held their future in my hands. A part of me wanted to laugh, to revel in the poetic justice of it all. But as I looked at my daughter, her face streaked with tears, I realized this wasn't just about revenge anymore. This was about respect. About them finally seeing me for who I truly was, not a burden, not a maid, not a mouth to feed, but the backbone of the family they had so carelessly broken. I leaned forward, my voice steady but firm. "Do you understand now what it means to cast someone aside? Do you see what happens when pride blinds you to gratitude?" She nodded, sobbing harder, clutching her husband's hand as if it were her lifeline. For the first time in years, she wasn't just my daughter, she was a woman humbled by her own mistakes, finally realizing the cost of arrogance. The silence after my words hung heavy in the room, pressing on all of us. I could hear the ticking of the old clock on the wall, each second stretching out, reminding them that time, and mercy, was in my control. My daughter clutched the note she had written, twisting it in her hands like it might somehow undo the damage of the past. Her husband avoided my eyes, his shoulders slumped in defeat. Finally, I spoke. "Do you remember," I asked softly, "when you were 10 years old and you wanted to go to that expensive summer camp? We didn't have the money, but I worked nights sewing dresses for neighbors just so you could go. You promised me then that you'd never forget the sacrifices I made for you." My voice cracked, but I didn't let the tears fall. "And yet, here I am, sitting in the home I paid for, listening to you tell me I was just an extra mouth." Her sobs deepened, but I didn't let her interrupt. I needed her to hear every word. Respect isn't about money. It's about gratitude, about acknowledging who lifted you when you couldn't walk on your own. And you, both of you, threw me away the moment you thought you didn't need me anymore. My son-in-law shifted uneasily, his pride stung by every sentence, but he said nothing. My daughter, however, crawled to her knees in front of me, clutching my hands. Mom, I was wrong. I was stupid. I thought being independent meant shutting you out, showing I could manage without you. But I was arrogant, and I hurt you. Please. I can't fix the past, but I'm begging you not to leave us like this. Her desperation pierced through me, but I stayed firm. This wasn't about cruelty, it was about teaching them a lesson that would carve itself into their souls. You want forgiveness? I asked, pulling my hands gently from hers. Then you'll earn it. Respect isn't something given when it's convenient, it's proven, day after day. You've shown me who you are when you have power. Now show me who you are when you've lost it. Her eyes widened, and I could see she understood the weight of what I was demanding. This wasn't going to be an easy path for her. It wasn't just about lowering rent or patching up a fractured relationship. It was about humility. About finally valuing the mother who had sacrificed 40 years of her life for them. My son-in-law finally found his voice, though it was weak. What do we have to do? His question wasn't about money or terms, it was about surrender. He was ready to let go of the pride that had fueled his disdain for me. I looked around the apartment, at the chaos, at their tired faces, at my daughter's trembling hands. For the first time, I felt a shift. They weren't my captors anymore, nor was I their discarded burden. The power had shifted completely. And it wasn't just about revenge, it was about restoration, about rewriting the balance they had destroyed. I stood, straightened my shoulders, and gave them one last, piercing look. You'll know soon enough, I said quietly. Then I walked out, leaving them in stunned silence, their shame clinging to them like a heavy fog. For the first time in years, I felt taller than the walls around me, stronger than the shadows of rejection. The days that followed were like watching a slow unraveling of everything my daughter and her husband had built. The eviction notices had already reached the other tenants, and whispers traveled through the building faster than fire. My daughter and her husband were no longer the respected couple with a secure future, they were the embarrassed landlords who had lost control. Every knock on their door, every letter slipped under it, carried a weight they couldn't ignore. And though I wasn't there to see their faces every morning, I knew the humiliation was carving deeper than any words ever could. But I didn't act out of spite alone. My silence was deliberate. I wanted them to sit in that emptiness, to truly understand what life without me looked like. Their calls to me grew more desperate each day, from curt demands to tearful pleas. And each time, I let them go unanswered. Respect, I thought, isn't begged for, it's built through consistency. One evening, after nearly 2 weeks of silence, I finally agreed to meet them again. I chose the cafe near the courthouse, the very place where I had finalized the building purchase. The symbolism wasn't lost on me. When I arrived, they were already seated, their faces drawn and weary, as if sleep had abandoned them. My daughter stood the moment she saw me. Her eyes were swollen from crying, and her voice trembled. Mom, we can't do this without you. I know I treated you terribly. I let my pride blind me, and I see it now. Please, just come home. Let's start over. I'll never make you feel unwanted again. Her husband, who once couldn't look at me without disdain, lowered his head and added, "She's right. We've been selfish, and we're paying for it. You don't owe us anything, but if there's even a chance to fix this, we'll do whatever it takes." For the first time in years, their words didn't feel hollow. They weren't demanding. They weren't dismissive. They were broken, raw, and human. I leaned back in my chair, letting their desperation hang in the air before I spoke. I didn't want this outcome, I said quietly. All I wanted was to be part of your lives, to be respected as more than just an extra mouth. But you threw me out without hesitation, as though 40 years of sacrifice meant nothing. That cut deeper than you'll ever know. Tears streamed down my daughter's face, and she nodded, unable to deny the truth. I softened my tone, though my resolve stayed strong. Here's the reality: you've lost the building. You've lost your tenants. But maybe, just maybe, you don't have to lose me. They looked up, hope flickering in their eyes. What do you mean? My daughter whispered. I folded my hands on the table. I'll keep the building. I won't undo what I've done, because you need to remember what happens when you push away the people who stand by you. But I'll consider helping you rebuild, piece by piece. Not because you deserve it, but because I still believe in family, even when it's flawed. Prove to me, through your actions, not your words, that you can honor the sacrifices I made. Only then will I let you back into my heart fully. The silence that followed was heavy, but it wasn't hopeless. For the first time, I saw humility in their eyes, a genuine desire to make amends. And in that moment, I knew the balance had shifted forever. I wasn't the discarded burden anymore, I was the matriarch, the cornerstone, the force they could never again underestimate. As I walked out of that cafe, the evening sun spilling across the street, I felt something I hadn't felt in years: freedom. Revenge had brought justice, but it had also brought clarity. They now knew the price of disrespect, and the value of the mother they had once so carelessly cast aside. And as I smiled to myself, I thought, sometimes the sweetest revenge isn't destruction, it's teaching someone that without you, they were never as strong as they believed. Thank you for watching. If this story touched you or gave you chills, make sure to like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe for more powerful stories just like this.